Hello, everyone, and welcome to For the Love of Language. I'm EJ.
And I'm Stacy. Welcome in, everybody.
Yeah, today we got a fun topic. We're going to talk about grammaticality, right?
Yes, we are going to talk about grammaticality. This is actually kind of a hot topic in linguistics lately amongst researchers. And it's been a hot topic for a while because grammaticality, this like weird concept, which we're going to explain in just a second, is basically how linguists conduct like research. At least the majority of linguists use this concept of grammaticality in their research. And depending on how you define it, some people will say, oh, yes, linguistics is a very sound, hard science, while others will say, nah, that's silly little, that's just bullshit, all right? You're just
Yeah,
getting people's opinions on things. That doesn't mean anything.
but what does mean anything, Stacy? Like,
Don't get existential at the beginning of the
I'm
episode,
sorry, I'm
EJ.
sorry. We're good. Okay, grammaticality. I
Come
think
on.
you brought up something interesting there, though, of like linguists just asking people what they think. I think it's good to draw a distinction between how a linguist might view grammaticality and how, like, an editor might view grammaticality.
Yes. So, I mean, a lot of this is going to kind of tie back to our previous episode about descriptivism versus prescriptivism. So, if you haven't listened to that episode already, I highly recommend it, where EJ and I talk about this at length about being descriptive versus being prescriptive. And someone like an editor for like a book or, just for like a newspaper or anything, when they're talking about grammaticality, or even like a teacher or grading assignments, when they're talking about grammaticality, it's going to be, okay, well, what are like the standard things that we use in a sentence that we need to see? Like, is your comma in the right spot? Are you like conjugating things the way that, normal people do? I mean, normal people,
Right.
the way that like is standard.
Accepted in an academic sense. Like the
Exactly.
real difference is that when you have a teacher or an editor or someone looking at it, they're looking at it through the lens of like what is right, what is wrong, like
Yes.
what is good English or whatever language you're talking about versus what isn't really accepted. Versus with linguists, I don't care what's right or what's wrong. Like that's such an
Mm-hmm.
arbitrary distinction. What we're looking at is more how are people actually speaking and where are their differences and why are there differences and like is grammar actually even a universal thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's kind of dive into that like a little bit more. For everybody here in the audience, a friend of mine actually wrote a paper and has been doing a lot of work about linguistic judgments and how the linguistic community kind of should be conceiving of these things and talking about these things. His paper is Schoenmacher's 2023. We will cite it in the caption so y'all can read it, and I will also kind of cite some of the resources that he cites as well in his paper. It's very well written. He's a great writer, but he talks a lot about this kind of subject and talks about what does it mean to what is this grammaticality thing that we're talking about. Turns out it's very contested amongst linguists what we're even looking for in the first place. So when a linguist usually asks for a grammaticality judgment, what you'll usually see, just to kind of like give an example, is they'll give you a sentence. So they'll say like, the dog runs by the house. And I would ask EJ, okay, do you think that's grammatical?
And I would say yes, that sounds
EJ would
very
say
natural to
yes.
me.
Yes, that sounds natural. That sounds normal. Other like there's recently in the last few years, there's been like a shift for people to say instead of asking if it's grammatical to ask if it's natural. But there is some debate about what that captures necessarily. We'll go into that in just a sec. But then EJ would also be presented with a different sentence of like, I don't know nothing about nobody. And
Mm-hmm.
I would say, do you think that's grammatical?
And being a linguist, I would say, I think there's dialects where that would be totally acceptable. But if you were to say something instead, so like there's different aspects of this. You can look at things from different dialects, like using words like ain't and stuff. But you could also say, with your original example, oh, the dog runs by the house. Let's change that syntactically and say,
Mm-hmm.
the dog by the house runs.
Mm-hmm.
And then that would more broadly be like, no, that's Yoda speak. That's not English. That doesn't sound normal and grammatical.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So that's kind of just like a sampling of like the questioning that linguists do amongst themselves and amongst like lay people. So these kinds of questions, what are they looking at? Like what is the point of these questions? Are we, when we're talking about like our linguistic systems inside of our head, do these questions kind of poke at the right bear, so to speak?
Well, and that's a really broad question in and of itself, because theoretically, every time that a researcher is writing a paper or asking these questions, the question isn't just what is grammaticality, but they're coming at it with a specific hypothesis about a specific syntactic or morphological structure. And so there are some people that are going to be looking at like, oh, what is grammaticality in a wider sense? What are the trends across cultures? But there's also going to be researchers looking at like very specific grammatical questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. But on a more philosophical like standpoint, what are these questions eliciting? Like
Mm.
what does it mean when we're asking people to reflect on their own perceptions of language?
Now that's a good question.
That's the real question here. And it is kind of agreed upon with like linguists, even like Noam Chomsky himself and a bunch of other linguists have kind of like stated that like we can't see into our own linguistic system. Like we can't, like there's not a specific part of our brain that we can kind of dig into and be like, oh, this is how that works. We don't know how it works. So when we're reflecting on our own language, we're looking at like performance effects is how they call
Right.
them.
Can I just like hone in a little bit more on what you said there?
Yeah.
Like, I think the really important distinction that Stacey's bringing out is that there is a difference between a study that just observes conversations and
Mm-hmm.
like listens in or reads texts that are written by native speakers. There is a big difference between that and asking people what they think about the language that they're speaking and how they perceive the language that they're speaking. And these grammaticality studies are asking people, like, does this seem grammatical to you? Does this feel grammatical to you? And there's going to be instances when maybe you have classic example ending sentences with prepositions. Who do you want to go to prom with?
Mm-hmm.
Is a totally valid question, right? That totally works in English. But if you ask someone that sentence in a linguistic study, even if they might accept it, they might be thinking, like, oh, well, maybe I would say this, but I know it's not right. And so then are you
Mm-hmm.
actually gauging how language itself is used, or are you gauging what prescriptive rules people have learned? And there's so many other levels that go on to this when you're
Yeah.
asking people how they perceive language, because people are not accurate perceptors of
Yes.
themselves.
Yes. So this is very true, and this is the exact point that we're trying to make, and that us linguists are trying to like understand is okay, there are so many confounding factors as to how people are like self-reflecting, right? Like they're not looking inside of their internal systems, and a common person is not going to think about like, oh, they're trying to understand what feels natural and what is like a possibility within my grammar of like, of all the different sentence combinations I can make, this one is like a valid choice.
But the moment you start thinking about language, it stops feeling natural because it's such a
Yeah.
subconscious process most of the time.
Exactly. So this leaves linguists and other people. This is also a common problem with like psychologists and stuff. My friend mentions a couple different studies that psychologists did where they were trying to kind of like do a similar thing, but psychologists immediately threw it like out the window because it's not something like measurable. It's not something tactile. You're essentially just like sampling people's reactions to things. And that's the same thing my friend points out and phrases it as like measuring someone's reaction to the brightness of a light. Like, is this light bright? Yeah, no, it's a pretty bright light. Do you think it's more bright or less bright than this light? Yeah, yes, I think so. Like it seems brighter to me. It's a matter of like perception. So
And if you ask someone about a light when they're in a dark cave versus it's like a sunny day outside, you're also going to get totally different responses.
Right. But if you ask an electrician about the brightness of a light, they're going to give you a different answer because they're considering like they know what you're getting at, right? They understand kind of like what you're tapping into. You're not necessarily asking them about their personal perceptions of the brightness of the light. They understand that you're maybe trying to see what their thoughts are about the internal mechanisms of the light. And so this is the issue that we run into. And so what do we do about it? I'm going to ask you, EJ, like, how do you think linguists should approach this?
It's very contextual, right? Like, I think for me, if I was looking at the grammaticality of something, so let's go back to the example of using the word ain't in a sentence. Like, if you're doing a study, you generally need to start with a hypothesis. And so I might generate a hypothesis on the spot of like, ain't is frequently used and more so in specific dialects of English than in others. So like ain't is a socially accepted word in certain areas and not in others. Like that might be my hypothesis. And then if I was going to come at it with that hypothesis, and that's just like a very, very simple one, right? Like, is this thing accepted? But you could do it with syntactic structures. You can do it with vocabulary. You can do it with phonetics. Like, is it okay to say this word this way? But then what I would do is you want to get a good sample size so that you have significance, right? So you need to talk with enough people from different regions and have, set questions that you're going to be asking them all the same way. And you don't want to necessarily tell people exactly what question you're trying to answer because that can like skew how they'll respond to the questions depending on how things go. So before you ask anyone the questions, you would have everything well written out because this is working with humans. You'd have to go through an IRB to make sure that you're doing this ethically, but you'd have all of your questions figured out and your study methodology figured out, and you'd maybe even want to review that with someone who's another linguist, a professor, like make sure that you're approaching things in a really good way, and then have a good set of questions that you're asking people from the different locales to try and verify your hypothesis. And so, I mean, that's a little bit broad. Like that's kind of how the scientific method works in general. Like you come with a hypothesis, you test it, and then you analyze your results, come to your conclusions. But I think when it comes to the question of grammaticality, there's not like a blanket thing I can say, oh, you would do this for absolutely every question. Like I think you'd have to follow that normal research process, but the way that you approach it is going to depend very much on your specific hypothesis and what you're trying to prove. Like if that's a difference between regions, if that's about a specific type of structure. I had a professor who talked about trying to test the nuances of Spanish word endings in the sense that there's words like agua in Spanish that is feminine and it follows the generic pattern of ending in A. And there's lots of words in Spanish that end in A but are masculine. But like if you look at the word agua, it ends in A, it is feminine, and yet you'll use the masculine word el and say el agua instead of la agua because you don't put two A's next to each other. So it's like saying an apple instead of a apple. And so you say el agua, el águila, all these words. So when you're using that masculine article but a feminine word, then what happens with the following adjectives? And it turns out there's actually some variance in people using, masculine or feminine adjectives following these, subtle differences and nuances in Spanish. And so, like, if you're trying to look at something that specific, you're going to try and get people in natural conversations where they're talking about water, where they're talking about eagles, and all of these other Spanish words that have this pattern where you're using that masculine article and the feminine noun, and just try and get people to like describe these things in normal flowing conversation so they're not thinking about their language too much and you're able to observe the adjectives that they're using. So that's a little bit of a more specific example, but there's all sorts of variance that could happen here.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, elicitation is definitely like it's ideal, right? Because you're actually seeing the linguistic reality of what's happening. But in terms of like linguistic perception, right? There is like linguistic reality, and then there is also space within linguistics for our perception of language, because our perception of what we're doing greatly affects things like linguistic change and like socio-linguistic factors and like all of these things. So there is a space for these types of things.
And that's a good call out. My like first example was like you're asking people, is this grammatical? And that was more about perception. And my second example was more of the like actual observing people speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So of course it's going to be contextual depending on like what exactly you're looking for. But if we're talking about, especially if you're asking like questions about like complex syntax structures that you're like not going to see necessarily naturally, stuff that you can't super elicit, understanding people's perceptions of those things is also going to play like a huge part of it. So my friend kind of breaks up this idea of what grammaticality, like what types of grammaticality questions we can look at. Essentially, he says that there's 3 different dimensions to this idea of like grammaticality and our perceptions of language, right? And so there are essentially like 3 different types of questions you can ask, and you're going to get different results based on those questions. And they're going to tell you something different about people's perceptions of their internal linguistic systems, depending on how you phrase it. So one of those is, of course, acceptability of like, do you think this is good? And that will give people's perceptions on whether like that's actually like it's not a bad question to ask, right? Especially if you're trying to understand how like sociocultural like norms are affecting people's perceptions of their language. Like that could very well be an important thing for your study, right? Like if you're asking people about contractions and how they feel about contractions like ain't or double negatives, right? Having an understanding of people's perceptions of that is part of the study of like, okay, well, how often do people use this but still think that it's a bad structure to use, right? So acceptability is definitely like a part of the grammaticality thing, but it does kind of like focus a little bit on more of the like social perceptions of things. But the next thing that he calls out is probability. And this is something that often gets kind of like clumped in with, so like other researchers are like, oh, if you just ask if something is natural, then you're gonna like, do you think this is a natural structure? People might often respond with what they think is the most probable answer, not necessarily their own personal views on it.
So what you're saying there is, instead of like actually answering with like, what I think in my soul, I'm instead saying, oh, Stacy asked me this question. What is the answer that Stacy's looking for? And I'm going to try and give her that.
Not necessarily. Think back on our example about like double negatives or like ain't, right? If I ask you if that's like a natural structure, if it's okay to say like ain't or use a double negative, your first thought is like, okay, well, maybe I don't use it, but I know that there are other people that do. It is a possible structure. It is not outside of the realm of like human probability to generate this structure. I've heard people say this essentially of like, I might not say this, but I know other people say this. So it's likely that it's grammatical because I know other people use it.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's another really interesting concept. And so when you're asking about if something is natural, people might often say, might kind of use their prescriptive brain and also their probabilistic brain and be like, okay, based on this idea of what naturalness might mean, I could say, it's likely that this structure is acceptable. So even if I personally might not use it, it is possible within the realm of like the world of English speakers, right?
Okay. That makes sense to me.
Exactly, which is why my friend and colleague kind of separated that out, and it was like, okay, there is acceptability. They're saying like, yeah, I have personal feelings about whether this is like okay or not based on like prescriptive things and like other sociocultural.
Yeah.
And then there's just like probability, like
Mhm.
would you hear this in like everyday life? And that's more of like what a lot of linguists are trying to get at, right? Like when you're talking about using masculine articles with Spanish words that are typically feminine, and how often the following arguments are then masculine or feminine, there's going to be variation on that. And so people's like idea of like how often that might happen might play a part in it, right? They're like, well, sometimes I hear this, but like other times I don't. It's like up in the air as to whether or not this is something that's acceptable
And then
versus
you'll also have some people that say, like, well, agua is still feminine, and therefore this is like clearly this is what it should always be.
that's still acceptability, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that's still asking about acceptability, but asking about probability is like, would you hear this? Have you heard
Mm,
somebody say this structure before? Like,
right.
is this something you would hear? And people would say, yeah, but it's not right. Right?
Uh-huh.
Is how people would say it, which is fine.
Yeah,
You
but I
know,
judge those
if
people
we're
hard.
if we're talking about the responses that linguists like, and we're asking, have you heard somebody say this before? And they say yes, but we don't care about the but, right? Like that, you can keep your butts. The fact that you've heard somebody say this before means something. That means that it is within the realms of possibility. Even if you might not generate this structure, you know that it is a likely structure inside of your head, which
Yeah.
means that you're capable of structuring it that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Leading to like the validation of that structure. So if we're not sure if like a syntactic combination is possible, like probability questions and probability judgments are pretty important, right? Of like, is this like a possibility? And especially with complicated things, we're talking about kind of like small, easy to kind of like pick at things of like, yeah, that you could hear somebody say that like double negatives are a thing, contractions are a thing, mismatches in gender, like those are like a thing. But when you start talking about like syntactic islands, and I won't even go into starting to talk about syntactic islands because I have a very rudimentary understanding and I just hate them so much. But if you start getting into like really complex structures of like, can humans even put these kinds of things together in a sentence? This is where
Oh,
probability is like very important for asking, you know?
interesting. And you could have other studies that are like, is this understandable regardless of whether it's grammatical? Which would be an interesting tangent. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, I'm super, super curious because you mentioned acceptability and probability, but you said there's
Yep.
three. And so I'm like, dying, what's the third one?
What's the third one? The third one is one that I had never even considered before, but one that my friend and another scientist, another linguist who's got papers forthcoming on this. So I can't give you dates because the papers are not quite out yet. Romand talks about this and has actually kind of brought this in from the field of art history and like psychology, and it's this idea of linguistic feeling. How does it feel? Is this sentence
Hmm.
beautiful? How does it make you feel? And that is like it's a very interesting concept of like asking people how it makes them feel. Like, do you think this is, it's not, it's kind of stepping away from some of these other very ideas that we've seen a lot, and being like, okay, do you think this is like a beautiful structure? Do you think that this is something that could be used in like poetry or prose, or like does this structure kind of make you like agitated? Does this structure make you feel, like normal or comfortable? Does it like elicit, what kinds of like emotions does it elicit? And that's like a very interesting concept, because linguists don't usually look at language from like an artistic point of view. I'm going to pause for a second because I want to hear your reaction to this.
I like it. I think that's a fascinating take. I do think there could be a good amount of overlap between like acceptability and feeling, but I also think when it comes to feeling, you're going to have a lot more preferences come in for maybe certain phonemes, maybe it's, metaphors and poetry, like the rhythm, the cadence, the intonation, like those things are going to have a much bigger impact on feeling than they would on either of the other two aspects. And so like when I think just in the context of our podcast here, I think you could apply these three things, right? And this is maybe like a little bit tangential to grammaticality, but like acceptability, I would hope that we're using theoretically acceptable language, people are understanding it and it's not like cringing every time we formulate sentences, right? Like I would hope that that's the case. Probability, other people could potentially be saying similar things to us and like aren't going to be shocked by the structures that we put together unless we're like explicitly trying to say something out of whack. But then feeling, I think a lot of that to me does come down to intonation, presentation, the pauses, the way you're expressing
let's step
yourself.
back for like a quick second. What if like a sentence was given to you on a piece of paper and somebody asked you, how nice is the wording on this piece of paper? How nice is it?
I would object to the word nice, but
I'm using a translation.
Like, no.
I'm using a translation. I'm using a Dutch translation from my friend's paper. My friend is Dutch, by the way.
Yeah, how?
But like, how appealing is this?
If you're looking at written stuff, I think there's definitely a few things that come to mind that I would consider. One of those is like, is this cliche? Is this something I've heard a billion times before? And if that's the case, if it's like boring, I'm probably going to say no. I don't, care for it. It's not appealing to me. Versus if it's something, and that's partly a content thing aside from the structures and the syntax and everything else. But there is also something to, if you're looking at a longer text, one of the things is going to be the variability and like sentence length and how you're starting your sentences. And I don't know.
Let me throw an example out at you. Let's do double negatives. I ain't got nothing to do today. How nice is that? How does that sound to you? Does that sound nice? I ain't got nothing to do today.
I think I would put that like relatively nice actually, because it sounds just like really, I don't want to say natural because that kind of fit into the acceptable thing.
It's comfortable.
But it does.
It's comfortable.
It's very comfortable. It feels like something that, you would just say on your phone, chilling at your house when you're talking to a friend. Like there is something appealing to maybe like the context that I imagine around that sentence even.
And that's more of like what this aesthetic judgment is kind of going for, of like, okay, I ain't got nothing to do today. That might not be acceptable for some people, right? But it might be probable, but it's also aesthetically pleasing in some way. And like, well, that's not something often considered by linguists. It does kind of matter when you think about it. Like when you're thinking about probabilistic like data, I mean, of course that's like important for like hard science, but like our aesthetic judgments about our own language are also kind of informing how much we use them, how we perceive them. Essentially, like as we're reflecting on our own language, to what degree are we using language in a way that like feels comfortable, in a way that feels good, in a way that feels beautiful even. And how does that kind of like impact our perceptions of things? Because like you could have a really beautiful sentence that means absolutely nothing, right? Or like vice versa, you could have like a very short sentence that you just kind of feel all right about, like it's like or maybe it's like structured in a weird way where you're just like meh.
Yeah.
You know, like if someone were to give me a sentence that uses a syntactic island, I won't even start to generate one because I struggle with them deeply. Like in a grammatical sense, I just can't do islands very well. But if someone were to give me a sentence that had an island in it, I would say, yeah, someone might say that. I guess it's acceptable, but I don't like the way this sounds. I don't like the way it looks. It feels wrong on a lot of levels. And like, because linguistics is such like a human, it's such a human experience, that aesthetic judgment is like important on some level. And I won't go into some of the stuff that my friend did with these different types of judgments. You know, we can save that for like another day.
And we will put the citation in the
We will put the
notes on our
citation.
episode.
This paper that he wrote does, like, he's a very experimental linguist, so he does deal with like a lot of data, is very data driven, and is very like determined to produce hard science out of like soft concepts, is kind of how they talk about these things in like the science world. So if there's a way to measure these kinds of things, like we're trying to do that. But in doing so, we have to kind of consider these like three elements of people's perceptions and judgments. And even just calling that out, just calling out that these three things exist, is honestly quite a big step. Of like, we have to really acknowledge what we're perceiving when we're asking people to think about language. And all three of these aspects might not be important necessarily for scientific inquiry, but they're at least important to consider as you're kind of thinking about how you want to test something. How are you going to structure your language to elicit the perceptions that you want from your speakers?
Definitely. That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
I know. Did I blow your mind a little bit? I'm not gonna lie. My friend kind of blew my mind a little bit when he proposed this to me.
Yeah, like I wouldn't have thought of aesthetics and the feeling as an aspect of grammaticality. So I do really like thinking about that. That's probably something I'll think about a little bit more later.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we're just like talking about grammaticality more generally, one other thing that I would like to just touch on briefly is that I think grammaticality itself can also be context dependent and like form dependent. And a big one there is with like music or poetry frequently would break the norms of what you would expect for grammaticality in prose.
Yeah.
And it's just that our expectations and what we accept in those forms is different from in text. And you could still apply these three concepts to poetry, but I would do it separately than to prose because the outcomes will be different. So I just wanted to call that out.
Yeah, those are also just like, two different points of inquiry, which is totally fine. But like you said, it is like the different contexts in which these kinds of judgments, or these kinds of, how we're asking people about their perceptions, do kind of vary depending on the context. So like in terms of scientific inquiry, there's still a lot to be done, but I really enjoy stuff like this, because when we're thinking about like linguistics as a science, it is often considered to be a soft science in the realms of like sociology, anthropology. It's not like physics, where there's something physical that we can like measure and say like, okay, the distance between these two atoms is this, therefore this.
And it's a universal truth, and it's deterministic, and like it being more of a human science, linguistics is not like that.
Right. But there are ways that we can we can utilize this softness to our advantage to
Mm,
approach things and conceptualize of different ways of approaching it to make it more of a hard science, to find that like data that we're looking for.
right.
So by reflecting on its softness, we can kind of make it hard, which is like a weird thing to
Yeah.
say.
No, I get
Okay,
what you're
that,
saying.
yeah.
And I do also want to caveat what I just said, because like there are definitely aspects of linguistics that are universal, and there are definitely like some, clearly defined rules and patterns and
Mm-hmm.
things like that that do show up.
Yeah, I mean phonetics for one thing is very like hard and fast, right? Like you can measure someone's vocal tract and figure out stuff based on that.
But those universal rules are usually not the rules that are taught in school, because the
Mhm.
rules that are taught in school are not those inherent natural things. Like the fact that they have to be taught as rules shows that people are otherwise breaking them, which means they're not the universal truths around linguistics.
Yeah.
So there's some really interesting stuff there. But yeah, I'm glad you shared this. I'm excited to, look more into this paper myself.
Mhm.
So yeah, is there anything else that you would add on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of want to like tack it off with one last thought of like papers like this are important. Examining how different languages do different things is like really great and all, but reflecting on scientific methodology is imperative for the continuation of scientific inquiry. We have to be able to look at ourselves as scientists and be like, where are we fucking up? Where can we be
Mm,
better?
yeah,
How can we make our questions better and to get the data that we want?
100%.
And it's something that's often overlooked because it's not the pretty side of things. It's not the exciting, like, oh,
Hmm.
look, I found a brand new thing, right? It's critical. It's critical to ourselves and to other scientists, and people don't like being criticized.
For
but
sure.
but it's definitely very, very important. And I think it's also important for people to know that this happens behind the scenes. And this isn't happening just in linguistics. This is happening in other places too. This is happening in medicine, in physics, in chemistry. People are examining, what kinds of beakers are going to be best for certain experiments and why.
Mm,
It's important to call us out on our bullshit. And I think it's comforting for me anyway to know that there are scientists out there who take this kind of stuff seriously and want to consistently improve methodology so we get better results and so we can further our progress,
totally.
because innovation is absolutely amazing, but reflection is a huge part of the scientific process that is often overlooked.
I love that. I love
Thank
that
you.
call out. And I would totally love for us to come up with a simple hypothesis and like actually go through this process
Mm-hmm.
together. I think that could be a fun thing for our listeners. And, if we could find a fun question, it could be exciting and stuff for us as well. But yeah, I don't have anything else to add here. So thanks so much for listening. Follow us on Instagram at For the Love of Language. Wherever you're listening, feel free to like and give us a review. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time.
Thanks all.